Hello, hello, Garland Nixon here, and I am live, and we're gonna have a great show. Unfortunately, we had a little audio problems with my first guest, but we everything else is going to be rolling, and we've got Jim Cavanaugh, Dan Lazare, and we have Dr. Gerald Horne. Let's talk. Hello, one and all. Hey, look, I had a little trouble. I need some feedback. I need some feedback. Is everybody sound okay? Good, good, good. Thanks a lot. Chicken Patty said sounds excellent. Yes, I had a guest who is actually in another country, and we were having problems getting the sound going, but that's okay. We'll figure it out. Eva Jane, she's awesome, and we'll get her back on soon. But at any rate, we got plenty to talk about today. We got a big show, and I'm going to start off like this, since I hadn't prepared. Let's do some Q&A, some question and answers. What do you think are the big stories of the week? I think, to be quite frank, I think the big story of this week, and I think it's one we'll remember for a long time, and people will be discussing for a long time, and that is the NBC News article. I did a let me find it. Let me find this NBC News article. It is huge, and it is. This is a big one. This is the big one. Let's see. Let me get this up. This is the big article of the week, and I'm going to share it with you. And I think it will be one that we'll be talking about. I'm sure everybody's already knows what it is, and that is this one. This is the article of the week, and that is where basically our government, in through Ken Delaney, and a guy who is has spent his career being a CIA operative, just wrote an article where they came out and admitted it. And here's what I think is it. They came out and admitted that they're lying to us. They came out basically and said, look, for those of you who had any questions, who have been guessing, we just lie. We just flat out lie. And what was interesting about their article is not only did they flat out lie, even in the article, they couldn't help themselves. They lied about lying. I'll just go over one little part of the article. That's where they said, that they, in an attention-grabbing assertion that they made headlines around the world, U.S. officials said they had indications suggesting Russia might be preparing to use chemical agents in Ukraine. In the next sentence, they say, but 3 U.S. officials told NBC News this week there's no evidence that Russia has brought any chemical weapons near Ukraine. They just lied. I mean, the first paragraph, our government finally comes out. Oddly enough, how paradoxical is that? The only time they could tell the truth is when they told the truth to say we're lying. And what a great paradox. I feel like smoke's coming out of my ears. You know what? We finally decided to tell the truth. Okay, what do you have to say? We're lying. Well, then, a la the infamous conversation with Captain Kirk and Mr. Spock. Well, if I know you're lying and you're telling me that you're lying, that would mean you were lying. So you must be telling the truth. So is it the truth or a lie? Oh no, we go down a paradox. We go down a rabbit hole from which we cannot return. But even then, the thing I had to bring out was, but even then, they couldn't help it but lie. The next sentence they said the U.S. released the information to deter Russia from using the banned munitions. Here's again, how paradoxical is that? In the first sentence, they say Russia didn't have chemical weapons. And then they say, we knew it, so we lied. And then they say, but we only lied to stop them from using the chemical weapons that we just told you they didn't have. They can't help themselves. They can't help themselves. And the other thing I think is of great consequence, and that is people are starting to realize something. People are starting to realize that, particularly, I think a lot of the Europeans, that these sanctions, and if they don't realize that they will, these sanctions probably ain't going to hurt the Russians nearly as bad as they're going to hurt the Europeans. The Europeans are going to get smashed by these sanctions. And one could even now, we're going to be thrown in a recession. I mean, to me, this marks a very interesting period in time, when the Europeans are their ass is grass. And these sanctions are the lawnmower. It marks a very significant period in time. And this is something I've been talking about a while. And that is the US empire saw threats from smaller countries, wouldn't do what we told them to do, wouldn't give us their natural resources and oppress their people and make their people suffer, all the horrible things that we like to do. People wouldn't do it. So we would crush them with sanctions because it was a small country. We could sanction them. And the American people didn't even realize that it was hurting us because it was in small ways and in ways that we couldn't really quantify. So this mad machine was doomed eventually. The US empire was doomed to one day say, well, we got to step up. We're dealing with these little countries and sanctioning them. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to move up and we're going to sanction a big country. And we're going after the big boys now. We're tired of catching these little fish. We're going to catch the big ones. So what do? Now we're going after Russia, right? There's a number of problems. Number one, the fish is too big. Number two, globally, it's too big, it's too powerful. So militarily, the United States cannot just go use military might against them. For those there are a lot of people, I may be wrong, there are a lot of people who say the US wants to escalate this thing militarily and NATO wants to escalate this thing militarily. I don't think they want to. I don't think they want to because I think they recognize that on the European continent, see, Russia's military is created to fight on Russia's border. That's everything it's designed to do on their border, and that they can do, and that they can do well. They're designed like this is going to sound crazy, like a military is supposed to be designed defensively, right? So you've got this really powerful army on its border. If you're fighting Russia on its border, it has no supply lines. And it's firing missiles from deep within its border. The Black Sea is there. They own the Black Sea. You can't bring ships in the Black Sea or Russia's going to sink them. Russia can fire from all over the Black Sea, submarines in the Black Sea. So if you go to Russia, go to war with Russia's border, Russia now owns the Sea of Azov. Where are you going to, that's a powerful defensive move that they've taken also to take the entire coastline of the Sea of Azov. So they've set themselves up to defend their border. So I don't think the US wants to really, and NATO, go to war with Russia. They don't want to. A lot of people think, oh, they're going to go up to that. I don't think they want to because they already know that militarily they'll be in a bad situation to go toe-to-toe with Russia. And even to argue that they could use nukes against Russia would be suicidal. So could they do it? Would they do it? It's possible. But I don't believe that they want to. The plan here, remember, the plan here is an economic war on Russia. Russia goes into, and might I add, they mistook what was going to happen in Ukraine. What they thought was, we're going to bait Russia in Ukraine, and Russia's only going to come in as far as the Donbass, and they'll fight on the Donbass, the eastern Ukraine flank, and we will have the rest of Ukraine, and then we will put all these sanctions in place, and boom, we got it, because they could care less about eastern Ukraine anyway. Now, they didn't think that Russia would go as far as they have. They miscalculated. They definitely miscalculated. So now the best they can do is propaganda. So as Russia is decidedly winning the war, they have to say they're losing, but which is fine in the propaganda space, but it doesn't really do you any good on the battlefield. So Russia's military is strong, but now that they've taken the Sea of Azov, now that they can work out of Ukraine on their border, they're even stronger. They've got Belarus, they've got Ukraine, they have the full coastline of the Sea of Azov, and of course the Black Sea, right? So Russia's even stronger on its border. So I don't really believe that NATO and the US wants to tangle with the military. I believe this was all about World War III economically. Could it happen? Technically, but I don't think they really want to do it. And so now Their thing was, we're going to go after them, and all these sanctions is going to wipe Russia out with shock and awe. And stay tuned. In another, hopefully 3 minutes, our next guest will be here. It was about shock and awe. And of course, shock and awe didn't work in the Middle East, and it never works, but it doesn't work here either. So they've decided, we're going to hit Russia's economy so hard that it just falls apart. And in reality, they were living in this neoliberal world where an economy is made up of derivatives and asset-backed securities and magical financial tools that Wall Street and London comes up with that don't really mean anything. And what the world found out, and this is the worst part of it for the U.S. empire and for the U.S. London, Berlin economic system, the world realized something, and that is that the economic value is about hard commodities. And so the economic value is about, what do you have? Do you have gold? Do you have silver? Do you have palladium? Do you have titanium? Do you have gas? Do you have oil? See what I'm saying? Where I'm saying? And or industrial capacity. China has industrial capacity. India has industrial capacity. So the world started to realize, wait a minute, this magic that they use in the Western economic system really doesn't have any value unless you believe it's good. When that happened, so initially the ruble dropped because of speculators were scared. But once the speculators woke up about halfway through the month and they started looking, and they're like, man, Russia's doing okay. Well, holy crap. They have hard commodities. In the long run, they ain't going nowhere. When this crap blows over, whoa, they're still going to be good. So what happened was at halfway, I think, through the month, when people realized that the economies of countries who have hard commodities is of more value and is going to weather the storm in the long term, you see the ruble coming back. So now the only thing these sanctions can do is backfire. Well, we now have with us my good friend and a brilliant man, the one and only Jim Cavanaugh. Jim Cavanaugh, welcome to Saturday Morning Live.
Hi, how you doing, Garland?
Oh man, outstanding. You know, I was just talking about something. I want to get your thoughts on it. We're talking about economics, and I think, and I was saying, you know, the ruble in the early, you know, in the beginning of the Ukraine military operation, invasion, whatever you want to call it, the ruble took a dive. There was a lot of discussion around the world, and I think the worldwide economy, east, west, everywhere, speculators everywhere started looking and really recognized that the magical financial tools of the West don't really have any value, and that countries that have hard commodities, wheat and gold and palladium and titanium, et cetera, can weather the storm in the long run, and that in itself was a major shift. That's why we see the ruble coming back. That the big reason to me that the ruble is coming back is because when the worldwide economic minds watched Russia able to weather this storm, they realize it's about the world that we live in. It goes all the way back to the feudal times when people actually traded hard gold and spices and things like that, that no matter what you do, when it gets down to it, if you got things, you've got an economy. And if you got magical financial tools, those things are liable to fall apart at any time. Okay, Jim, let me get your thoughts on all of that.
Well, yeah, I mean, look, I'm a proponent of MMT, so I'm not, you know, I think that it is absolutely true that, you know, money means nothing outside of the resources it makes, it allows you to get access to. Okay, that's what money is about. It's about helping to function, the economy to function, and helping to produce and exchange real goods and services. So, and you have had in the United States the deindustrialization for 30 years, 40 years, which has, you know, which, you know, this is Michael Hudson's great about this. You know, we've changed into a finance economy, a rentier economy. Once you get people, once money becomes the central item in the economy, you're in trouble, because money is nothing in itself. And it is, what we're seeing here is it's a political creation. The dollar is a political creation of the United States of America. There's nothing necessarily wrong with that. That can function very well if it's done correctly and it's done democratically and it's managed democratically. So you've seen the deindustrialization of America at the same time as America has maintained absolute control of the financial system. That's also a political fact, that the United States, after World War II, took control of the financial system, took control of all the institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, and made the dollar the central currency for exchange in the world. And after 1971, when the convertibility of dollar to gold in international relations was ended by Nixon, the dollar was itself, it's a convention that the world has agreed to use for most trade. And that, on the one hand, that's a political construct and a political and social convention. On the other hand, it makes you very powerful, because the United States is able to control all the dollars in the world. Since the United States creates all the dollars in the world, it can control all the dollars in the world. Since the United States controls politically the banking and financial payment systems in the world, it can stop banking and financial payments. Now, what happened here is that the United States did something extremely radical in terms of a world capitalist system. It seized the sovereign assets of the dollars that Russia held in the Federal Reserve Bank. This was, you're not supposed to do that. This is private property in a capitalist world. If you do that, you're doing something which is war, essentially. And so what people saw is, they've seen it for a while with Russia, and they've seen it for a while with sanctions on Venezuela and Iran. But now they're seeing one of the major countries in the world, which is one of the suppliers of essential commodities, both in terms of agricultural and industrial production. And we're seeing their wealth has been seized by the United States because it was all in dollars, because it was all in institutions that were controlled by their financial system under the hegemony of the dollar. So what everybody in the world is seeing, everybody who has any wealth in the world, including the nations, is seeing is that we cannot count. We have no further confidence in the ability in the fairness of the United States, or in the idea that the United States won't just take our dollars. So we don't want to have dollars that much. Okay. So Russia then instituted in its own defense, and a very smart move, a way of trading for rubles, with skirting around the dollars by going through gold, etc. And that became necessarily a popular thing to do, because people need the resources that Russia has. So they're willing to pay rubles for it. Don't care what you pay for it. So this is going, but the long-term effect is that the entire world, anything and anybody who has wealth that needs to be stored away for a while, is got to say, I don't know about storing it in dollars, because they can take it, and they will take it for political reasons that I have no control of. So that is going to eat away at dollar hegemony, and eventually, the idea that the dollar is the form of payment for all the goods and services in the world in international transactions is going to dissipate. It's going to decline. It'll still be there, but it's not going to have the 90, 100% role in international relations that we have. So other currencies are going to come in, but every nation who has a currency is going to have to solve the problem of, how you exchange your currency with others, and how you value your currency in relation to other currencies. And that's what Russia and China want to do. They want a new system of that. What we're seeing here now, what people are getting in a hand on, is that we can't let the United States decide that for us.
Jim, what I see, there was some discussion that, well, China's or the ruble or which currency, as if we're going to enter into a similar paradigm where just some new currency supplants the dollar as the hegemonic currency. What I see is countries, based on what you said too, a lot of countries saying it's dangerous to allow a particular country to have hegemonic control. We're seeing the Russians saying, look, we'll do trade in rubles and rupees. Well, particularly for countries that do trade between each other. If I sell you things in rubles and you sell me things in rupees, and I need to buy stuff back from you, I can use those rupees to buy stuff back. You can bring the rupees. So I think what we're looking at a different paradigm. I think Russia and China and some of the big boys may come up with some kind of an international currency, but I think a lot of countries will find that the safe thing to do, as much as they can, is to trade in their own currencies. That way they don't hang their currency up with somebody who can take it, number one. And here's the other part. If I've got something that everybody wants, even if it's bananas, and I can do trade with, and I can buy stuff from them, grain, things like this. The more I do trade with my currency as a small country, if all I got is bananas, it strengthens my currency on the international market and makes me more resilient and less likely for one of the big boys to be able to take me out because my currency has some value. What do you think?
Well, you got to realize sometimes devaluing a currency is helpful. Devaluing a currency makes your exports cheaper. Okay.
Yes.
So devaluing a currency can be helpful to a country. You don't want your currency overvalued. So this issue of currency, of what currency to use in international transactions, as you say, nobody wants now. They see the dangers of depending on that being one single a currency that's controlled by a single country. And in the context of the domestic economy, it's a very good thing that you control your currency. You know what I mean? That your government controls the currency, and I mean that's been a positive thing. You have a fiat currency that the government creates and controls. That's not a negative thing. That can be a negative thing, but it's it frees you up from the gold, from any kind of commodity standard. So what you're going to have, I think, everything for a while is you're going to have a lot of trading that's going to be done ad hoc. That's going to be done on ad hoc agreements based on particular arrangements regarding this resource, this commodity, this transaction, these two currencies, two national currencies. But it's probable that somehow an international mechanism is going to be set up which devises a currency standard. There was a thing called special drawing rights by the IMF, which is based on a basket of different currencies. So no one currency. So you create a kind of virtual trading currency called a special drawing right, which is based on a basket of currencies. But that's controlled by the IMF, which is controlled by the United States.
Right.
So
right.
you have to have a system now which is different. And this is really at the most fundamental level what the fight is about. It's about America's ability to control the world in every sense, in the economic and political and military sense. And, there's been a lot of resistance politically to the control of the United States in the world over the years, and even some militarily that's been successful. But the economic control and the control of the financial system has not been challenged as much. And nobody was in a position to do that. Russia, China, India now certainly are entering a position where they can do that, and they can insist on changes. What those will be at the end of the day, how this will shake out, we don't know. And it's very interesting. It's going to be very interesting to see. And a lot of people are going to get very discombobulated by it in a lot of countries. So, we're going to have to see how that works out. But I think at the end of the day, we're going to have some kind of international agreement that constructs something like a reserve currency that people can, generally speaking, make trades in, that will translate into their own currencies in a win-win way. That's kind of the slogan of the Chinese, and I think that's what we have to look for. Not a way that maintains the hegemony and the control of a single country, and that's what the United States is going to fight to prevent. And we'll see.
Well, the other thing I think, and this is all related, I've heard it said, I'm sure you have too, that, you got to have three things. You got to have a military, you got to have energy, you got to be able to produce your own food, and you can weather the storm. So with these sanctions, the true fact of the matter is the U.S. can do those things. We could run through hard times, but in reality, we can survive. You know what I mean? Like, we can survive because we can do those three things, ideally. Russia can do those things. Russia can survive. To me, the area, and Russia is in a block with India and China, so they've got industrial capacity, and because they're operating as a block, they can make it. To me, the people who are left out in the cold here is the EU. The people who are going to get crushed immediately by these sanctions, the people in the long term who will be exposed, is the EU, because the EU can't produce their own food. They're dependent on somebody from energy for energy. Russia's next door, they can get it cheap and survive. Everyone else is a long ways away, and for them to maintain their industrial capacity and their standard of living, it's going to be hurt by having to get really energy from anywhere else because it's farther away and it has to be transported and it's going to cost them more money. Your thoughts about the EU and where they fall in this kind of new reorder and the sanctions and all of this?
Well, again, Michael Hudson makes a very good point, which is that this is a war against Germany as much as against Russia and against the EU. Because look at it the other way around. That bloc, that Eurasian bloc of Russia, China, India, the question for the EU is whether it's going to join that bloc, whether it's going to become more interconnected with that bloc. Doesn't mean it's going to stop trading with the United States, but it means that whether it's going to start recognizing it has an interest, a strong economic interest in having strong ties with that bloc and becoming part of that bloc. And this is what the United States is dead set against. They want to prevent the EU from doing something which is in its economic interest. This is what they did in Ukraine in 2014. 2013-14, they want to prevent the EU from doing something which is in its economic interest, which is becoming more integrated into that great Eurasian bloc. And they want to just stop that. They want to cut it off. They want to build a new wall, which is an economic Berlin Wall between Russia and Europe, and keep the EU and make it even more dependent on the United States, both politically and militarily. And this is essentially what this is about. That's what happened in Ukraine in 2013-14. Yanukovych came in. They all had the dazzling vision of being part of Europe in their minds.
Yes.
And Yanukovych pitched that himself. We're going to become part of Europe. But when the deals were on the table, the deal with the EU, which was a deal, you come with us and you cut off Russia.
Yes.
And the deal with Russia, which was, here, we'll send you gas at this price. We'll do this. We'll do that. You don't have to cut off with the EU. You can have relations with them too if you want, but we're going to supply you with and the United States, it didn't want that. And they promoted this idea. No, you want to be part of Europe. You want to be part of Europe. So there was a lot of, because Yanukovych himself had promoted this with the help of people like Paul Manafort, who was working for the United States in the Yanukovych regime to integrate with the West, to integrate with the United States. There was a lot of ideological, and the Americans promoted, you're breaking with the EU, you're going to be you're a pro-Russian guy. But he looked at the deal, he said, this is a terrible deal. And it's going to hurt Russia, it's going to hurt Ukraine. And it has hurt Ukraine. And it's been devastating. And people don't understand that. The economic situation in Ukraine is terrible. And so that's what the Americans did to Ukraine, and it's what they're doing to Europe now. They're saying, we're going to cut off all relations with you. So this is a fundamental struggle that we're going to see play out over years, because these sanctions and their demands from the United States on Europe to cut everything with Russia and put sanctions on Russia at the direction of the United States, and sanction, therefore, their own economies in a certain sense. These sanctions are going to be hurting for a long time. And when will they go away? When will the United States say, okay, it's time to end the sanctions?
Sanctions
when
never
Russia
end.
says, when Russia says, we'll give back Crimea and we'll be a puppet of the United States like you guys are. I mean, that's not going to happen. So, the people have to realize that the one of the main enemies of neoliberalism, one of the points of neoliberalism, was to destroy social democracy in Europe, the social democratic paradigm in Europe. And it's eaten away at that for 20, 30 years. And this is going to be a nail in its coffin.
Well, Jim, something just dawned. I just had an epiphany when you were talking, and that is because I've heard it said World War III truly is the economic war, and that it's a war between the neoliberal model versus I don't know what you'd call it, but a model that we see China, that we see Russia have. I've been to South America, and that's the model they want. And that model kind of works like this. The strong central government, right? Because I've been to South America, and then this is what they tell you. This is the model they want. A strong central government that nationalizes the natural resources and maybe some of the main industries of the country. China doesn't have the natural resources, so it nationalized their major industries, right? and uses that income to finance industry, social safety net, et cetera. And they don't tax the living daylights out of the people, and they have a strong social safety net, and they build infrastructure, et cetera. If you look at Russia with Gazprom and things like that, what do? They've nationalized this stuff. They bring that money in and they build airports and roads and all kinds of things. While it's a capitalist country, they still use that kind of same model. And what it just struck me was World War III started in 2014 because there sits little old Ukraine, and the EU says, here's the neoliberal model, you austerity for your people, and we're going to rob you blind and take all of your natural resources. And Russia said, here's this Eurasian / South American model, we'll give you cheap energy and we'll do some bargains with you and deals with you, kind of mutually beneficial deals. And ultimately, Ukraine had to say, hey, we'll take the Eurasian model, we'll call it. And the neoliberals said, you're not powerful enough to stop us militarily, economically, and socially, so we will crush you and force the neoliberal model on you. And now it's gotten to the point where it's militarily threatening to Russia, and Russia's like, that ain't happening. And so that was the battle, in a way. We got about 2 minutes, Jim.
Well, yeah, Michael Hudson talks about, I'm trying to remember exactly his terms, finance capitalism, financialized capitalism versus what he calls socialist industrialization, socialist development, which is the Chinese model. It's essentially the state maintains a strong guiding role in the economy, and whatever capitalist social relations are essentially under the constraint and control of the state. And the point is to develop the economy's industrial capacity and capacity to produce, not to make financialized rentier profits. And that is a big split in the world. And in the, who knows how that's going to develop,
right?
From the side of what he calls socialist industrialization, China and Russia, et cetera. But it is a model that has been successful, and it is appealing to third world, to developing countries, and the United States does want to put a stop to it and does want to maintain the financialized game of economics in which, billionaires reap profits while they're in their sleep.
The billionaires back better model. That's what we'll call it. All right. Well, thanks a lot, Jim Cavanaugh. I certainly appreciate you coming on, man, and look forward to talking to you again soon.
All right. Thank you.
All right. And now we are fortunate to have the one and only, the brilliant and very good friend of the show, Dr. Gerald Horne. Dr. Horne, welcome back.
Thank you for inviting me.
We've had a theme going on today that I'd like to get your thoughts on, and that is the issue of this. We could call it an economic war. We could call it an economic reorder, but the sanctions against Russia have revealed a lot of things to us. Here's one thing I was thinking, if we're sitting on a desert island and you got a bag of money and I got a bag of apples, the apples are much more valuable than the money. And with these sanctions, we see potentially the ruble coming back. We see, and I put it, I'll end up with this. We see, if we say three economic entities, the United States can create their own energy and grow their own food and militarily protect themselves. They can survive. Russia can do all three. They can survive. Europe, not so much. They're in a world of deep and serious hurt. So we're learning some things. What are your thoughts about this economic reorder / World War III economic and what we're learning from it?
Well, I think what you've outlined may be an aspect of the much ballyhooed phase of the political economy of planet Earth that we may be entering. I'm speaking of de-dollarization. Initially, de-dollarization, that is to say, the decline of using the US dollar as the primary mechanism for trade internationally. Even if, for example, India was trading with Russia, it would be denominated in dollars. But obviously, with the sanctions, that may wind up to be a self-inflicted wound on the dollar and on US imperialism. And this then leads for an alternative to the dollar. Initially, as I was hinting a moment ago, we had thought that the alternative to the dollar would be the euro of the European Union, or perhaps the Chinese renminbi. perhaps a basket of currencies that would include the aforementioned two, along with the Canadian currency, the South Korean won, the Australian currency, etc. That still may be in motion. However, another aspect of de-dollarization, which your question/comment suggested, may be the advent of commodity-based currencies. That is to say, since Russia is replete with commodities, natural gas and oil, not least, as we all know, then that helps to underpin the ruble, which of course has recovered all the value that it had lost since February 24th, 2022. If that evolves, then I think we also should take a more close and careful look at Africa, because to the extent that the North Atlantic countries and their allies, such as Japan and South Korea, are able to, for example, boycott Russian gold, well, then the alternative will be South African gold. To the extent that the United States turns its back on Russian uranium, to that extent, the United States will have to turn to uranium from Namibia, the northern neighbor of South Africa. Likewise, with regard to petroleum, to the extent that the United States twists the arms of its so-called European allies and forces them to boycott oil, petroleum from Russia, then the alternative will be to turn one's attention to Nigerian oil, Angolan oil, Algerian oil. Likewise, with regard to natural gas, it's not only Qatar, the Persian Gulf monarchy, that stands to benefit if Russian natural gas is boycotted, but also Algerian natural gas. Algeria, of course, pumps natural gas in profusion into Western Europe as we speak. And within 24 hours or so, we may get an idea of which way the winds are blowing with regard to the aforementioned and with regard to the underlying crisis, speaking of the crisis in Eastern Europe. Because as we know, France is going into elections tomorrow. The once formidable lead that the incumbent President Macron had enjoyed is shrinking rapidly. He's being challenged from the right and from the left. And thus far, the US press, as is their tendency, they've given a lot of attention to the right-wing candidate, Marine Le Pen, whose party has both Islamophobic and anti-Semitic roots, anti-Jewish roots. Although, of course, she's been made to look more respectable, I'm afraid to say, with the entrance into the race of Eric Zemmour, the commentator from France's equivalent of Fox News, who is even more rabidly reactionary than Madame Le Pen. But if Madame Le Pen does do well, which is what the US press is telling us, I think the way to interpret that is to interpret it as a repudiation of France's policy with regard to NATO and with regard to the crisis in Eastern Europe. That is to say that Mr. Macron has not carried forth on what he has suggested for oh so many years. He has suggested for oh so many years that NATO is brain dead, that France should embark on a policy of strategic autonomy, distancing itself from US imperialism. That has been his rhetoric, but has not been his actions. And so now Western Europe, including France, is being hammered. As Moscow commentators often suggest, these sanctions against Russia in many ways are the North Atlantic countries sanctioning themselves. And sanctioning themselves has meant a rise in price of gasoline at the pump, which makes what has happened in the United States seem mild and tame by comparison. It's been a rise in the price of food. And the opposition candidates in France have been hammering on these pocketbook issues And underlying these pocketbook issues, of course, are the mishandling of this crisis in Eastern Europe by President Macron. And so if he is punished at the polls, and if he is not able to survive this election tomorrow and the runoff in case no one gets 50% tomorrow, then that will obviously lead to a change, I would hope, with regard to North Atlantic policy towards Eastern Europe. And that, it seems to me, would be well overdue.
The other thing I think for Europe and even the medium to long term is that they have, Germany, a lot of industry, huge companies, gigantic, Siemens and BASF and Mercedes, Volkswagen, on and on and on. So there are two issues. One is the survivability of these companies, but the other thing in the long run is the competitiveness. So they'll be competing against China, US, etc. So Russia has so many resources right now. One of the things they're doing, since the US is sanctioning, they're simply saying, well, we got a lot of oil and gas. We'll offer it to other people at a discount price. So now you have people rushing in to buy Russian commodities. They've got so much they can sell it at a discount price, and India can't buy enough of it. They're happy. So meanwhile, you've got China, you've got India industrially buying things, commodities at a discounted price. If it gets back up to market price. And because of the sanctions and their association with the US, now, rather than just simply make a purchase at the best price for their industry, the European countries have to pick and choose via sanctions what they can buy. And they're buying, for instance, energy and oil. When they've got energy and oil next door, they got to buy it from halfway across the planet. They've got to buy these other goods from other countries. And here's the thing. If you're a country in Africa and you know that these European industries have to buy your stuff and they can't get it from Russia, you can jack the price up and take them to the cleaners. So the other part is, will the EU industry be able to remain competitive in the new order if they adhere to the dictates of the US empire?
Well, it is well that you're focusing on the European Union, the giant with the feet of clay, which has been marched to the brink of disaster by US imperialism. And it reminds me of the title of an album by the late, great multi-instrumentalist Rahsaan Roland Kirk. The title of the album was Volunteer Slavery. And that, in a sense, describes and encapsulates EU policy. In other words, they're going along with their handcuffing. They're going along with the destabilization of their economy. I mean, the self-inflicted wound is gaping, to put it mildly. But I think in order to understand it, you have to understand the long-range vision of the North Atlantic countries, which inferentially was revealed just a few days ago by Mr. Stoltenberg, the Norwegian who heads NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, where he suggested that its title notwithstanding, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization intends on expanding its jurisdiction into Asia. Because as the North Atlantic countries see it, China is the big enchilada. I've maintained from the inception of the conflict in Eastern Europe, and you can verify and validate this by looking at the piece I wrote on the website of Black Agenda Report shortly after February 24th, 2022, where I suggested that this whole conflict was about China, but that Washington and its allies found it difficult to confront China frontally and directly, because that would mean confronting Tesla, Apple, Microsoft, GM, KFC, Apple, at all, not to mention Starbucks. And so the strategy basically is to weaken China's partner, which is Russia, and engage in what has been called a reverse Kissinger. Recall that the current conjuncture in which we're now ensnared was inaugurated about 50 years ago when the Nixon-Kissinger trips to China, effectuating an anti-Soviet entente. Up to that point, of course, it seemed as if imperialism was on the back foot. Grenada Revolution, Nicaraguan Revolution, Iranian Revolution, the list was expanding. And then came not only the entente with China, which then effectuated an encirclement of the former Soviet Union with the European nations on one border, Japan, South Korea, and then China on the other border. And of course, the Soviet Union collapses by 1991. Supposedly that leads to this unipolar moment, which now has or seems to be expiring. Interestingly enough, we were marking just before February 24th, 2022, the 50th anniversary of this Kissinger-Nixon trip. And so that's why the Donald Trump foreign policy, from the point of view of the US ruling class, in a sense makes more sense than the Biden-Harris foreign policy. What I mean is that it's apparent that Trump was trying to effectuate an entente with Moscow, to put it mildly, while turning up the heat on Beijing. Biden-Harris are turning up the heat with regard to both Moscow and Beijing. And that was a losing proposition 50 years ago. It's even more of a losing proposition today. But I think that the North Atlantic countries feel that they don't have many options because the half-century long entente with China led to massive foreign direct investment in China. China is a major trading partner of the European Union, a major recipient of foreign direct investment, not only from Volkswagen, but GM as well. China is on the verge of challenging Boeing by building its own aircraft. And by the way, some of the rare minerals needed to build aircraft are disproportionately housed in Russia, which then will improve the possibility of China being able to build a competitor to not only Boeing aircraft, but Airbus, which is the European Union competitor with Boeing. And so looking over the horizon, the North Atlantic countries felt that they had to make this riverboat gamble. It was either go into slow and terminal decline or roll the dice by marching the planet to the brink of World War III, which is where we are now, to be blunt, and hoping that China blinks, Russia capitulates, and voila, perhaps there will be another long lease on life for the North Atlantic countries. Interestingly enough, we have been rescued from a challenge to that strategy by the serendipity, pardon the expression, of Nancy Pelosi being infected because she was on her way to Taiwan, one of the highest ranking US officials to visit this rebel Chinese province, which China claims as its own, which the United States is turning into an unsinkable aircraft carrier. But with her infection, she's postponed the trip, perhaps canceled it. The spokesman for the Chinese Foreign Ministry promised and pledged and vowed consequences, his word, not mine, if she arrived, and conveniently, she will not be going. But this attempt of the European Union to break ties with Russia is a fool's errand. It would be as if New York would seek to break ties with Los Angeles, for example. I assume it could be done, but it would be wholly disruptive to the North American economy. Because as I've said many times in the past and mentioned in the aforementioned article in Black Agenda Report from early after the intervention of February 24th, if you look at your map, Russia is the giant of the European continent. It's the giant in terms of population. It's the giant in terms of resources. And so there is a natural linkage and compatibility between the Russian economy and the economies to the West. But that sort of linkage would be inimical to the US empire. So it has done its damnedest, not only by helping to sponsor NATO, the anti-Russian alliance, but then egging on Great Britain, which right now is in the sad state, and in some ways being to the right of the United States on the Ukraine-Russia issue. And so thus far, on the one hand, this attempt to disrupt EU-Russian relations has worked, but the ultimate victim, as already suggested, may be the European Union itself.
Last question, about 4 minutes on this. You know, traditionally, one of the issues in an empire, in imperial collapse, is internal uprisings. I have a feeling that the coalition government of Olaf Scholz is not long for this world. How do you see the issue of internal uprisings affecting these dynamics? In that, particularly in Europe, a place, France, Germany, we have seen many times where there's people with yellow vests running about. We've seen clashes with the police. They love their uprisings in Europe. And when they start, as I've always said, when you run out of, when the countries historically, when countries run out of bread, it's off with the leader's head. Hopefully, metaphorically, of course. But I don't think it's going to be a pretty sight. And what do you think about internal uprisings in Europe, the changes of government, et cetera, how that affects these dynamics?
Well, I think that's possible. Let us start with Great Britain, where obviously the clown prince, Boris Johnson, had one foot on a banana peel before this crisis. He was being hammered from pillar to post about Partygate, this idea that in 2020, while he was issuing regulations telling people to stay at home, he and his staff were partying like it was 1999. But alas, Mr. Johnson apparently has been rescued, at least temporarily, but the kind of internal unrest that one espies in Great Britain is not going away. Not going away, certainly, is the idea that Scotland may secede from the United Kingdom. The Scottish National Party is much more to the left on most issues than Mr. Johnson's Tories. Now, supposedly, Mr. Johnson has to give an okay for another secession referendum, but I dare say that even Mr. Johnson himself might not be able to reverse the tide of Scottish independence, because quite frankly, Scotland could probably profit and benefit more easily and more readily and more lucratively from joining Brussels, joining the European Union as an independent country, as opposed to being under the thumb of London and of England. We've already made reference to France. And in my previous remarks, I did not mention the campaign of Mr. Mélenchon, the candidate of the left in his party, France Unbowed. Pay careful and close attention to his results tomorrow, because unlike 1776, which supposedly was a revolution, but actually was a counter-revolution, as I said in my book of that name, and helped to extend the lease on life of enslavement of Africans and gave more impetus to seizing land from the indigenous, creating this right-wing juggernaut now known as the United States of America. The French Revolution, compared to what happened in North America, was much more progressive in its early stages. It led directly to the Haitian Revolution, which abolished slavery. And even when slavery came back, and those of us who are descendants of the enslaved should pay attention to that phrase, that even after slavery came back in Guadeloupe, after the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte, you still had the core of a progressive movement in France. Part of the problem has been in Europe that too many of our friends on the left during the Cold War basically went along with right-wing talking points. right-wing talking points were that if you could just get rid of the Soviet Union and get rid of their allies, such as the Communist Party in France, then all would be hunky-dory, pardon the expression. But what we see is that with the erosion of influence of the Communist Party of France, what you see basically is the rise of the aforementioned National Front, which is challenging to lead the country despite its Islamophobic and anti-Semitic roots. And I find it remarkable, and assuming that we survive climate change and nuclear war, I think historians of the future will find it similarly remarkable that few people are commenting on this contradiction, that trillions were spent to destabilize communist rule all over the world, not least in Moscow. And then you have their dislodging and non-communists come to power in Moscow, and now we're on the brink of World War III. I mean, shouldn't someone try to connect the dots and perhaps say, well, maybe it wasn't such a wise idea to pursue that Cold War policy? But of course, many of our friends on the left, they were cheerleading. Now, I think that's one of the problems they have today, because many of our friends on the left, many of them were hammered, oftentimes unfairly, for being agents of a foreign power. Now, if they knew history, they would know that the right wing always challenges their opponents, accuses their opponents of being agents of a foreign power. In the 19th century, if you were against slavery, that meant you were an agent of London.
Right.
So London was more advanced for decades on the question of slavery than Washington. Then in the 20th century, if you were for progress, you were an agent of Moscow. And so now the friends on the left, they're scattering and heading for the hills because they don't want to be accused of being agents of Moscow. And so now they've become cheerleaders in a de facto or indirect sense for NATO. Speaking of which, pay careful and close attention to that vote at the General Assembly, which led directly to the suspension of Russia from the Human Rights Council, but featured 58 abstentions, and about half that number of no votes. And if you look at the population totals, if you look at the fact that Indonesia, China, Nigeria, South Africa, India, Iran, etc., did not stand with the North Atlantic Bloc, well, then you get an idea of the correlation of forces. And I hope our friends on the left pay attention to that, because I would hope that they at least do not want to be isolated in a corner with the North Atlantic Bloc, the declining defenders of white supremacy and imperialism, and trying to undermine the real and legitimate aspirations of what is called the global South, but which is actually the world's majority. So we shall see what unfolds.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Gerald Horne. Certainly appreciate you coming on, taking your time out on a Saturday, and I hope to talk to you again soon.
Good luck.
Thank you. All right, next, continuing from New York City, we got Dan Lazare. Dan, welcome back.
Thanks for having me.
Well, Dan, we've been talking today about the economic reorder of the world, about the economic consequences, about about this kind of economic World War III, right? And I had an epiphany, man. I had an epiphany, and I realized something. In 2014, when the U.S. took over it was the Maidan coup time, when the U.S. was instrumental in overthrowing the government of Ukraine. What happened before that? The Ukrainian president, Viktor Yanukovych, had an option. He had the neoliberal model offered by Brussels, right, which included austerity, the usual suspects. Austerity, screw your people over and you'll get nothing in return. He had the kind of, we'll call it the Eurasian model. It's a model, having traveled to South America extensively and talked to people in South America, I understand the economic model they want is similar, which is simply a kind of democratic socialism wherein the government, because I talked to the people directly in South America, they're like, well, the government nationalizes the resources, whether it's oil or lithium or whatever it is. The government then sells those resources and uses that money to finance a strong social safety net. Poor people are taken care of, and we don't get taxed to death. If you look at Gazprom, if you look at China using it with their major industries. So we can call it the Eurasian model or whatever. And when Yanukovych said, well, I can't, basically what he said is, I can't raise the prices of fuel and put austerity on my people. I got to go with the Russian model. I mean, with the Eurasian model, the government was overthrown. And one could argue that was the opening salvo in this economic world reorder. And here we are today. Anyway, your thoughts on that, Dan?
Well, I mean, I agree. Let me think. I think, first of all, to me, the one fact that really jumps out at me is what's happened to the ruble. After February 24th, the ruble plunged and seemed to be completely cratering. But since then, since February 24th, has actually come back, recaptured all its former value, and even then some. Actually advanced a trifle above the February 24th level. And I think the reason for that is pretty clear, that the sanctions are backfiring because they are leading to cutoffs in oil supplies and grain supplies, fertilizer, etc., that Russia and the Ukraine had produced. And this is fueling inflation. Inflation was already underway before this happened, but this is unquestionably giving it some added juice. So therefore, and curiously enough, the sanctions, by closing off Russia, closing off those supplies, actually has added to this problem. So the West has really, so the West thought that sanctions would cause the Russian economy to collapse, but that strategy is really backfiring. And that's really, really important. All over the world, we're seeing, accelerating inflation, food shortages, food insecurity in many countries, and Russia, by comparison, because its main commodity exports are appreciating in value, has actually seen an economic firming. So it really is a case of the West shooting itself in its own foot. Now, this could change if the central banks start raising interest rates, as they already are doing, because that'll serve to depress commodity prices and could actually wind up hurting Russia ultimately, but at the expense of creating recession in the West. And either way, the working class is very unhappy. I heard Gerald Horne say before that the destruction of the left means that all that dissatisfaction is now being channeled by the ultra right, which is why Marine Le Pen is coming on so strong in France. And I expect the same thing's happening with the Republicans as well. So I think what we're seeing here is a real case, a real example of the centrist Macron, Biden, Schultz forces self-destructing, discrediting themselves in the eyes of the electorate, in the eyes of the working class, discrediting the war as well. And I think the center is emptying out, and what we're seeing is a gravitation to the far right, and maybe in the case of Mélenchon, the far left as well. We'll have to see about that. But the center seems to be emptying out really radically. And in terms of the economic reordering of the world, I think this means more power for China. I think it ultimately means less power for the US. And I think it means real economic distress in the global South, real distress, followed by real political turmoil. So that's my reading.
The other here's the thought, and it's kind of down the same line, and that is, it's kind of, I'll call this a return to bell bottoms. You go back to a time when something was in style, and I think what happened here in a way is it's a return to the reality of global trade. If you go way back to medieval times, if you had gold, you could trade them for spices. There wasn't this global economic, magical Bitcoins and asset-backed securities and things. Look, This country has something that you can load on a ship and bring to that country, and they give you some chests of gold for it. The reality then was, it's like we're sitting on a desert island. You got a bag of money, I got a bag of food. We can use the money to start fires with. The food is a value. And I think it is forcing, it's reality smashing through, saying, I don't care what you people say about this online computer system you have, where all you got to do is put a couple more zeros and you have money. When it comes down to it, on global international trade, the people who have spices and gold and energy and hard things are the people that matter. And like people like me are sitting here saying, man, I wish I'd bought rubles. How can I get my hands on some rubles? Why? Because they got stuff. You know what I mean? And China has industry. They make stuff. It's not magic. Your thoughts on this my thoughts of returning to the reality of global trade.
I think you're right in the sense that commodities like grain, fertilizer, and oil are appreciating in value. And so therefore those commodities seem more precious than they did previously. And everyone wants to get a hold of them. But I just would emphasize that when the central banks start contracting, as I think they will, we could see a commodities crash, which would wind up turning the whole picture around. In 2008, you may remember, oil spiked at I think it was $146 a barrel. That was in nominal terms, meaning that adjusted for inflation, it'd be somewhere around $300 a barrel, or 280, whatever the correct figure would be. But then it collapsed. And then roughly 2 or 3 months later, the stock market collapsed. So we could, I have, my crystal ball is cloudy as usual, but we could see some kind of replay of that drama. So that'll change everything.
Well, yeah, but here's what it sounds like to me. In that same way, I think I would put it a different way. Volatility, right? In that we could see a commodities crash. We could see some really big, look, and here's the other thing. If they do that, if they start screwing around with the interest rates, throws us into a recession. You see political and social volatility. But once that volatility, let's say it lasts a year, 2 years, 3 years, whatever. Once that volatility evens out, which inevitably, eventually it will. God knows what could happen in the interim. But once it does, you then get back to who's got the oil, the gas, the gold, the titanium, the palladium, the neon gas. At some point, here's what I'm thinking, Dan, and I want your comment on this. What's happening now is sure to create all manners of volatility, these sanctions and stuff in the short, even intermediate run. But a few years out, once this kind of gets rearranged, we could see that new reorder really start to even out. And we could see, particularly for the countries that are going to take the hardest, the global south, et cetera. But they got a lot of commodities. And we won't be able to sanction the hell out of them, because they'll be able to deal with Russia and China and India, et cetera. And so they'll have a little more opportunity. So we've got the short run, and God only knows what happens then. But if that somehow survives okay, in the long run, one could see a potential positive outcome.
If things rearrange themselves in the midterm run, but I'm not sure they will. I mean, I see deep instability all over the place, including and especially the U.S. I think the U.S. Political system, constitutional structure is fracturing. I think American society is a goddamn mess, frankly.
Yes.
Are we allowed to curse on this show?
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
So I think the U.S. economy is a complete. The U.S. society is a complete mess. I think it's an amazingly ill-governed, ill-managed society. I think that we're entering into a period of deep structural constitutional instability of the sort we caught a glimpse of on January 6, 2021, but which I think we will see more of. I think the EU is very unstable. I also think that China is unstable. And I think Russia is unstable also. So I see instability on both sides of the divide and all over. The reason I think China is unstable is that China, it sort of opted, although it's still in some way, some sense, some kind of worker state at the top. It allowed this, it fostered this huge capitalist structure underneath, and I think that that capitalist structure is now in deep trouble due to the real estate crisis in China. I remember that the real estate sector in China is proportional to the economy is 4 times that of the U.S. And I think the U.S. is already over invested in real estate. So that gives you the idea of the dimensions of the problem. And that problem is not being solved, and it really kind of can't be solved. I think that Russia, if you look at Russia, Putin is kind of a latter-day czar with one exception, and that is his throne is not inheritable. In other words, if he were to catch COVID, if something were to happen to Vladimir Putin, there is nobody to step into his shoes. There's no son anywhere, no all-powerful brother-in-law, et cetera, et cetera. There's just nothing. This is kind of in a certain way, this is kind of an old Islamic model where the ruler is increasingly separated from the people he rules. But that is the situation with Putin, as especially symbolized by those eerie shots of that long table, where he's at one end and 20 feet away are the others. So I think Putin is really cut off from the population, which merely says that if he were to go, there's no one to take his place. A vacuum would open up. There would be a power struggle, and then who knows what would happen then.
Let me ask you, I got a question about that particularly that I want you. One of the things I find interesting, Venezuela, if you look at Maduro, he's got, here's what we always say, these countries are an evil dictator. If you look at Maduro, he's got in the 60% range of approval ratings. The people there like him. And remember, Dan, part of that is this: when countries feel like you're attacking them, they will circle the wagons. Just recently it came out, 83% approval rating for Putin, 81% support the military operation, invasion, war, whatever term you want to use, it suits you. China, the last study I saw, between 86 and 93% of the people. When you look at at these countries, the so-called, evil dictator countries, and I think part of it is the United States kind of laying siege to these countries has created an environment where people have circled the wagons, at least in the short run. And you look at the numbers in the West, here, the government throughout Europe in the tank. So how do you think that dynamic plays out, at least in the short run? I think it insulates their governments, at least in the short run, from some hard times. And I think the Western governments who have the upside down numbers, it's very dry kindling, shall we say, for a match. Your thoughts?
I totally agree. But short run or even mid-term.
Yeah. This summer is what I'm talking about.
Yeah, but as I persist in believing the war is not going well for the West, and that there's ample political fallout resulting.
Yeah.
But if the military situation were to turn to Russia's disfavor, then I think what we'll see would be a loss in support for Putin. I mean, people don't like to lose wars, right, and they punish leaders who lose wars. That's the iron rule of history.
Yeah.
And so if that happens, the Russian people will be very upset. But if Russia starts faltering the battlefield, that'll place China in a very difficult situation. China will have to come to Russia's aid, because China knows. I mean, it just knows that it's next on the chopping block.
Yep.
If Russia were to go, this is quite clear. It's glaring. So China would have to come to the aid of Russia. Look, what's just amazing is that this huge crack has opened up in the international political edifice, and there's just no easy way out. I mean, this conflict is just going to spread and spread and spread. That's the amazing thing. I mean, I don't see any easy negotiated solution. I don't see any easy victory on either, Russia or NATO's side. I don't see anything like that. I just see deepening conflict and widening conflict.
Last thing, since if you got a couple minutes, I know
Yeah,
we're past our 20 minutes. If you got another few minutes, I'd like to ask
yeah,
you one more question.
sure.
The big story, and I will put it up right now. The big story, Caitlin Johnstone wrote an article about it. And everyone's been talking about this story. In a break with the past, U.S. is using intel to fight an info war with Russia, even when the intel isn't rock solid. We look down the story, and there is admission after admission that the U.S. intelligence has simply, absolutely, unequivocally, without remorse, lied to the American people. It's been covered extensively in alternative media, and all of the certainly questions are being raised. That leads me to this story and the reality that the lies of the mainstream media and their willingness to go along with any narrative put forward by the intelligence community, by the government, no matter how preposterous, it seems to be fueling the growth of alternative media. How do you think what do you think about this article and the media, et cetera? Put it all together, Dan.
Well, I think first of all, that Caitlin Johnstone was working off an NBC News article that was just unbelievable. And not only did the news report say that the CIA was doing this, but congratulated the CIA for doing it, and essentially said the press was stepping forward as the CIA's willing assistant. Go ahead, lie to us, please lie to us some more. Give us more lies, so we can do our patriotic duty. I mean, it was appalling. But this war is going to eat at democracy, what little is left of it, like an acid. It's going to corrode it. We're seeing censorship, and really serious censorship. You can't, I mean, YouTube is closing off alternative channels. It's really and Twitter is doing the same. The press is nothing but a pro-war monolith, with the exception of people like Tucker Carlson. And of course, with Tucker Carlson, with friends like Tucker Carlson, you don't need enemies. So the whole system is just galloping to the right. And I think that that's another example of the Bidenite center just self-destructing, because their war strategy is not going well, their economic strategy is not going well, and no one I don't think people really believe them or believe the press when they say this is all the fault of that ultra evil, demonic, satanic, etc. Vladimir Putin
or Trump.
The West or
Trump.
The West is blameless. We did nothing. We're innocent. We just extended NATO to the east because those Eastern European countries wanted us to, and how crazy of Putin to see that as a threat. I don't think people are buying that, and I think fewer and fewer people will buy that. So I think that the essential message that Biden is putting forth is gonna collapse. And when that happens, then I think he'll be in big trouble, and the Republicans will clean up. I'm more convinced of a Republican wipeout, a sweep in November than I was before, although that is still 6-7 months away. Right. So we've got to be very cautious.
Yeah, if the sweep is not the word for it. Although I do, Dan, if you got one more second, can I pose one more question?
Sure.
And that is this. You mentioned Biden. Of all people to have as the face of the government at a time like this, in this time, and particularly when the policies are just demonstrably counterproductive for every working class person, for everything the U.S. stands for, both good and bad. Does Joe Biden survive as president even until November? I don't think so. I think Obama is showing up at the he might as well had on a black robe and a sickle. I think he was the political death angel showing up for Biden. Anyway, your thoughts on Joe Biden, how he fits into all of this stuff?
I mean, I agree totally. Was it Biden paid a visit? Was it on Monday or Tuesday? I think it was to the White
Obama,
House.
yeah.
And he was mobbed. I mean, Barack Obama is the coolest guy in the room, right? I mean, but the footage that showed Biden, just like wandering around with a kind of a vacant look, and I've seen that vacant look before. He looks really old, and I say this is a man who's getting old, advancing in years myself. But he looks really, really old. He seems feeble, has a vacant look in his eyes. And it is a shocking development that this is the leadership at this time of unparalleled crisis. I don't think Biden really has a clue what's going on. He has a very distorted view of the world. He is blundering into a giant disaster, and he's just not in control. So therefore, I mean, what the political future holds, will he quit at some point and turn the reins over to Kamala Harris?
Harris? Think about that too. Comment on Kamala Harris.
And maybe Kamala will quit and he'll appoint Hillary as his vice president, and he'll resign. But none of this will work. This will work. I mean, we can't. The regime's in deep crisis, and the whole structure's in deep crisis. And I just don't. There's just no way out. There's no clear way out. That's the problem. And so the U.S. has really blundered into a huge mess. I know the U.S. leadership thinks that it's Russia that's blundered, but I really think it's the U.S. and NATO that has, it's a bridge too far. You ever see that great movie?
Yes.
It's just that they just chose a target that is just too far. They're grossly overextended. They've gotten over their ski tips, as they say, and they're going to wind up floundering, in my opinion.
And they did it right after COVID, when they needed to work on economic recovery from COVID. And there were people that were, you had the issue of the mandates, and there were, you had some social arguments about the way it was handled, and they needed to recover from that. And instead of that, they jumped off the deep end right into the 15-foot into the pool.
I totally agree. We live in a biblical era of plague, famine, and war. So the international situation is not in good shape. It's really quite perilous, and I don't think that Joe Biden or Macron or Schultz have and I think in some ways Schultz is most incompetent of them all. They don't have a clue as to what they're doing.
Well, you got to get Bojo's right at the top of the list. You can't leave him out.
We can't leave him out.
Yeah,
right.
So, I think they're all right. Thanks a lot, Dan Lazare. Thanks for taking Saturday morning out with us. Talk to you soon.
Talk to you soon. Thanks.
All right. Well, that's it. Saturday morning live here with Garland Nixon and friends. Unfortunately, there was a bit of issue with my first guest, and we couldn't get any sound. I couldn't hear her, so we'll get her back on soon. But thanks to everybody. Don't forget, I'm working together, putting together our own. How about this? Putting together a media outlet. I don't want it to be Garland's media outlet. I want it to be a media outlet where we don't have to be on YouTube all the time waiting for them to toss us out the door, and where we can get our own website up, and not just on Saturdays. We can do a lot more things, but I get a lot of great guests. Had a lot of fun. Do me a favor. If you're watching this on Twitter, if you're watching this on YouTube, if you're watching it on Twitter, if you're watching it on Facebook, make sure that you go to my YouTube show and subscribe. We need more subscribers. When you get here, smash that like button, as they say on the Alexander McCurris's show. Duran, love that show. Smash that like button and subscribe, and hit the little bell so that you will be notified when I come on the air. I've got a Patreon, patreon.com/Garland Nixon. Anything you can do to help will be a great help for the cause being creating our own media outlet. It's Saturday morning, so I'm going to do Saturday morning things at 11:30. Thanks a lot, Mindy B and Chicken Patty and all my friends out there. Peace. I'm out.